So welcome to the February team meeting with referees for First Tech Challenge teams in British Columbia. Kyle is here, he's our head rep, and he has some comments just based on recent Q&As and other rulings and things that happened at the qualifiers. And after that, we will open it for questions and answers. And I think there is a bit of a slideshow with a couple of reminders for teams. And then Kyle can launch into Q&As.
Sounds good. Thanks, Christine. Okay. So yeah, so just some basic info about the events. Make sure everyone knows the schedule, that judging and practice matches and inspections, importantly, will be on the Saturday, and qualifying and elimination matches will be on the Sunday. Things to bring, as usual, but this may be new for those who haven't competed at in-person events before, which I believe we have a few teams this year in that boat. Safety glasses, all your things. One really important thing I would like to encourage teams to do is to go through the robot and field inspection checklists yourself before the event and do a self-inspection and bring that with you to registration. That just makes the inspection process go so much smoother when teams have done that and made sure that they are aware of the requirements and being able to deal with things ahead of time. Thank you. And yes, the submissions by 8 p.m. on Thursday. I know we've had issues in the past with people being very close to that deadline. Please don't do that. Christine, anything to add there?
Nope. They just need to get them in by Thursday at 8 p.m.
Yep. Okay. So now on to ref things. So there has been a bunch of action in the Q&A and some significant changes to rules that are coming into effect for this weekend. Well, maybe not significant depending on your strategy, but some more than we usually see during the season, and also some things that have happened at previous events that I want to go over and refresh everybody's memories about. So as far as Q&A things go, one thing we had a lot of questions about at the BC Lower Mainland qualifier was about robot interaction at the junctions and what counts as blocking versus interfering with a scoring attempt versus a valid scoring attempt of your own that's allowed even if it's maybe in the way of someone else. So what that really boils down to is the pinning, trapping, blocking rules are in effect at all times. That if you see us pointing at you and giving you that count of 5, that you should be backing off from what you're doing. And I want to remind everyone that that count is not a grace period to continue doing the thing. It's a grace period to complete your getting out of that position. It does not mean you're allowed to block for 5 seconds. It means you should be attempting to stop blocking as soon as we've informed you that that is in fact what you're doing. And if you haven't gotten out of that position within 5 seconds, then that's when the penalties start. Now the junctions have additional protections on top of those rules when there is a cone in the junction area. So that cylinder extending up from the junction base. If you have a cone in there, then the rules are significantly stricter on what's allowed robot interaction, and anything that interferes with that scoring attempt by an opposing alliance would be a penalty. That said, Q&A clarified, robots are expected to complete scoring attempts in a reasonable length of time and not deliberately delay to block other robots. Basically, this is going to be something we will have to call based on what we see in the moment and our best guess at everyone's intent. But if you're at a junction clearly attempting to score a cone and in a prompt manner and getting out of the way when you've done that, you will be fine. If you are getting in the blocking access to junctions or colliding with robots while they've got a cone in that junction area, or being very slow about a scoring attempt when there's another robot trying to score on the same junction, that will be less fine. So I know that there's also been a lot of questions about when you have to back off from a junction. If you are, say, parked on a ground junction and another robot wants to score there. So in that case, if as the team who is being blocked in that situation, you need to make it clear to us that you want to access that junction with your robot's actions. Maybe that looks like you're holding a cone and pointing at that junction, something like that. But we can't read your minds, but if you make it clear to us that you are wanting to access that junction, the other team is obligated to let you, and we will be calling blocking on them if they do not. Any questions on that before we move on?
You are welcome to unmute and ask questions, or you can just type them in the chat and we'll read them out.
Hello, hello. Check 1, 2.
I hear you.
Hi. There's a question about a point made earlier regarding the pinning, trapping, and blocking rules.
Right.
You mentioned a point here that it's not a count for grace period, the counting to 5. It's a count to get out. And I'm just wondering if there are some telltale signs that differentiate between one and the other.
Yeah. This is like a lot of things. It's we have to try to judge their intent. But basically, what I mean there is that that rule doesn't give you permission to pin for 5 seconds. It gives you 5 seconds to get yourself out of a pinning position. If a robot is repeatedly pinning a robot and backing off within the count, what's apparently deliberately, we might still be looking at penalties there, even if they don't cross that threshold. If it's clear that this is deliberate pinning and that they are
Playing unfairly, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Understood. Yeah, I got that. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
I've got one.
All right. Hi, Jackson.
Is there a penalty if the robot bumps the signal cone, loses contact with it, but it continues to roll for 3 or 4 mats? In the Victoria qualifier, there was a penalty if you moved the signal cone 2 squares.
In general, herding or plowing the signal, I can see a couple of ways in which there might be penalties involved from moving the signal cone. So you're allowed to herd or plow it per Q&A 59, but not otherwise control it. I would say if you bump into it incidentally and it rolls, that's likely to be considered plowing and not a penalty. There was also discussion about whether pushing the signal cone so that it rolled into the opposing half of the field was considered autonomous interference. The Q&A answer to that is that it is not, unless it looks to have been done deliberately with the intent of putting it in the way of another robot. That short of that, the signal cone is a movable object and the autonomous program should be prepared for it to be in unexpected locations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so in teleop, it's okay if you bump it and it rolls. There's no
Yes.
penalty. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, what's not okay is grasping it.
Right. Okay. All right, I've got another one.
Yeah.
The mats interlock and they overlap a little bit. How are the parking zones in autonomous defined?
This would be a case of benefit of the doubt. It would be the outer boundary of the interlocking section.
Okay. All right, I actually have a couple more for you.
Okay, no problem.
If a fallen cone, not on a junction, supports another cone scored on a junction so that the second cone does not touch the ground. Is the second cone legally scored? The second cone only touches the junction and the first cone. It does not touch the ground.
So the second cone is not legally scored. So the first cone is not legally scored, but the second cone is somehow still on the junction.
Yeah, so the first cone, say we dropped it and it rolled to the base of the junction, then
Right.
we put a second cone on top of the junction and now it's resting on the first cone and it's not touching the ground.
That is an interesting question. I believe the answer is no. I'm just confirming that with the game manual.
Okay.
On a ground junction, the answer to that is no. A cone is secured on a ground junction when the base is either completely in the junction or completely on another secured cone. There is an exception to that with the low, medium, or high junctions. If the cone, if the pole passes completely through the hole of the cone, it can still count as secured even if it's not on a secured cone. So for example, if your opponents had placed a cone upside down, don't do that, by the way, that's also a penalty, but if they do, you're allowed to score a cone on top of that and it will still count.
Okay. All right, if a cone rolled to the bottom of the junction and another cone was placed on the junction and it slid down, does the one that slid down count as scored?
If it slid down into a valid position, probably pushing the other cone out of the way, that's likely fine. As long as the cone ends up in a valid position, it mostly doesn't matter how it got there.
Okay, what if the cone on the bottom does not roll away and it's just stuck resting on top of it and not touching the ground?
Okay, so if the cone is resting on top of another cone, if I understand you right, it couldn't also have its base completely in the circle of the junction and therefore wouldn't be scored.
Okay.
As long as the base is locked into that junction circle, other cones can be in contact, but unless I'm missing a scenario that you're picturing, I'm not seeing a way for it to be resting on another cone and still meet that requirement.
So I think Jackson's talking about a cone lying on its side at the base of a high junction.
Oh, sorry, you're not still talking about the ground junction. I understand. Yes, if the pole of the high junction passes through the hole of the cone, it is scored regardless of whether it's resting on unscored cones or scored cones or anything else for that matter, except a robot of the matching color.
Okay, thank you. All right, I got the last one. Our robot is in a U shape with right angles on the corners, so it's like a square U. When we grab cones from a cone stack, no more than one side of the U shape touches the stack. The ends of the U touch the wall, and our grabber touches the top cone of the stack. Is there a penalty when we pick up cones because of pinning? We did not design our robot to pin the cone stack.
From what you described, that sounds legal to me.
Okay. All right, so our wall is like this and our robot comes in like this.
Yeah.
And the cone stack is in the middle. Is that okay?
It sounds like it, yes. I would need to see the mechanism to be 100% sure, which will do an inspection, but what you're describing sounds legal.
All right, thanks. I have no more questions.
No problem, thank you. All right, so on to the next section of Q&A things I'd like to bring up, which is grasping junctions. There has been a lot of discussion about this on the Q&A, and what this comes down to is there's a new ruling which is in effect as of this week, so it will apply to our event, where this is about the case where you are catching the junction in a roughly V-shaped mechanism and when that counts as grasping. So in general, grasping is defined as having 2 or more contact points with opposing force. But the Q&A has clarified that we are to consider any sort of, if you're catching the junction in a V-U-shaped mechanism with a rounded corner at the base of it, that the radius of that curve has to be at least as large as the radius of a cone base to count as not constraining the junction. So they gave a couple weeks of grace period when releasing that ruling to hopefully give teams time to redesign their mechanism if they need to. So I hope this is not coming as a nasty surprise to anyone, but that is the official ruling as of this week of some of what counts as grasping a junction. And we will be checking an inspection for mechanisms that are whether robots are capable of grasping junctions based on that definition. Any questions about that? I know this is a big one for some teams.
I have a question in terms of how that affects the event.
Yeah.
Say a team does not pass that inspection.
Mm-hmm.
Are they then disqualified from playing their matches?
Yes, if robots have to have passed both hardware and field inspection to be entered into the schedule. They won't even be assigned any matches if they haven't passed inspection by that point.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
And if I suppose the other case is if a team makes changes or their robot is damaged during the day and we think they need to go back for reinspection and they fail that reinspection, yes, they will not be allowed to compete in any later matches unless they fix the problems and pass a reinspection.
Noted. Okay, thank you. Perfect.
Excuse me.
I have yet to have that happen, but okay, sorry, go ahead, David.
Thanks. If a cone is stuck at the top of a junction, like at an angle and won't fall down, is that point considered or is that not a point?
So that sounds like a case where the pole is not passing through the ring of the cone and therefore that cone would not be counted as scored.
Okay, thank you.
One side question. Regarding that new ruling for the inspection or like the shape of the mechanism to be more than the radius of a base cone.
Yeah.
That is taken into consideration with the robot inspectors, right? And like we're not the main only like line where that would be a consideration.
Yes, I will be talking to robot inspectors about that and possibly doing some inspections. I agree, this is one that's much easier to enforce at inspection time than it is on the field. We still will be responsible for judging whether something is grasping, but hopefully we can have a heads up going into this of which, if any, robots have mechanisms that are likely to be
breaking that rule.
Grasping.
Right. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Any other questions on junction interaction? One other thing on junctions is that if a junction pole is tipped over, which can happen, cones on that pole are not considered secured, which also implies that tipping a junction counts as descoring all of the opposing cones on it. So don't do that.
Question on that, actually.
Yes.
So would that be when the field is at rest and then the junction is left tilted at the end of the match? Okay. So if we were to tip momentarily and then the the junction comes back upright, then that maintains the same orientation and therefore all the cones are still scored?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Okay. Noted. Thank you.
And for what I've seen, a junction staying tipped at the end of the match would likely involve at least one of a robot being entangled with it and or significant field damage. So hopefully this is not something that would come up, but yeah.
It's gonna be an uproar if it happens.
Yes. Any other questions about junctions and grasping and those rulings? All right, sounds like no. I'd like to move on to another hotspot, the substation and human players. This one is a big deal. This is responsible for probably the majority of the penalties we saw at qualifiers. Please be careful about this from a couple of angles. One thing is that human players really, really need to keep your hands out of the field when there is a robot in the substation. And responsibility for that goes both ways. Drivers need to keep the robot out of the substation when there is a human player in it. And that it means you need to coordinate with your alliance partners. This is a busy, fast-paced area. There's a lot going on, but it is an important rule and it's a safety rule. So the refs will be watching this closely and we will be strict about penalties for this. So please plan your strategy to handle this carefully and talk to your partners about coordinating this. The other thing is interaction with the opposing alliance substation, which the main thing I can say about that is don't. The Q&A says, to quote, "The substation is a small and very important alliance-specific area on the playing field. Robots should be careful when operating near an opposing alliance substation. Rule violations near the opposing alliance substation should be enforced rigidly and quickly." So what this boils down to for you is stay out of the opposing substation. Don't block their access to it. Just stay away from there and it'll be simpler for everyone, please. Any questions about this aspect of things? Yep. All right, let's move on to, I also want to talk about cone handling. Another thing that we've seen large penalties for a couple of times is knocking over a stack of opposing cones. Keep in mind that that will get you opposing cone control penalty per cone in the stack. Also, some other, this is a bit of a miscellaneous category, but there's been some discussion about upside down cones on junctions. This is not allowed. This violates the rule against illegal use of game elements to amplify the difficulty of scoring, especially if you are, as was discussed, using this to try to fill up a junction to prevent opponents from scoring on it. So you're not allowed to put cones on upside down, and if you do, opposing cones are still allowed to score on top of them as an exception to the usual rule about having to be on top of a also scored cone. And there's also been some discussion about descoring. This is very easy to do accidentally on the ground junctions, so be careful with that, especially if opposing robots have scored on some of the ground junctions on your side, or especially the one next to your substation. So accidental descoring is one thing that we've seen a fair bit of. I would say be careful with that, but especially intentional descoring is something that we would be very quickly looking at penalties and or cards for egregious behavior. Any questions about cone handling and general robot interactions here?
So I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that they shouldn't knock over the opposing alliance cone stack, but you didn't say anything about them knocking over their own cone stack.
Knocking over your own cone stack is not necessarily a problem. I mean, it's probably not helping your gameplay, but if you do it without controlling the cones, i.e. by plowing through that stack, there would not be a penalty for that.
Thank you.
If you were to pick up the cone stack and turn it over, you would be controlling all the cones in the process and get penalties for that. But just knocking over your own cone stack is not inherently a penalty.
Excuse me. On the
Yes.
subject of cone stacks, so
Mhm.
if you accidentally knock over the cone stacks whilst trying to obtain one cone and only making contact with one cone, does that count as a penalty?
I don't see anything penalty worthy in that. That sounds fine to me.
Okay.
You've
Interesting.
only been in control of one cone. The interaction with the other cones was inadvertent, likely considered something like plowing, not control.
Right. This is one of the major changes for this provincials, right? In the rule book. Because I don't believe that I believe that you would get a penalty like earlier in the season. Although it
We
could be
gave out
wrong.
penalties for knocking over opposing cone stacks. I don't recall giving them for knocking over your own.
Oh, okay. I guess I just misinterpreted. Thanks.
No problem. All right. Finally, I have a couple of miscellaneous things. First of all, about autonomous. So there's been some discussion about interaction at the robot interaction and autonomous. In general, this is not something that should be happening. Anything that's considered intentional interference with an opposing autonomous routine would be some significant penalties. The Q&A has clarified that inadvertent interaction at the centerline junctions is not a violation of those rules. So if two robots go to score on the same high junction and collide with each other and they're both interfered with, that is not a penalty unless there's reason to think that it was done deliberately on the part of one or both teams. Finally, yes, there's been some talk about the signal like we discussed, like came up early on. So the signal, first of all, is not a scoring element. Most of the rules that apply to, actually basically all the rules that apply to cones do not apply to it. But that means that like most field elements that don't have exceptions, which in this year's games is just the cones, you are not allowed to grasp it. So that means you can herd or plow the signal. You are not otherwise allowed to control it. It's mostly not there after it's used in autonomous. All right, that concludes the stuff that I wanted to remind teams about. Are there more questions?
Hey, Kyle, I actually had one more question regarding
Yeah.
the V and U shape grab for the
Yeah.
junctions. I can see how it would we would judge the U-shaped ones, and you can just put a cone to it. But in when it comes to V-shaped mechanisms, do we just take the radius as the point where the two contact points are the widest, or?
So with a V-shaped mechanism, if it's true, the radius is effectively 0. You've got that sharp corner in the center. So that means if two sides of that V make contact with the junction, that is considered grasping.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Oh, in terms of inspections for something that has a V-shaped mechanism, though,
Yeah.
would that automatically disqualify them from having that pass?
No, that's not a fail inspection rule. That's just we as refs need to watch for that team because they've got a mechanism that is easy to end up grasping the junctions with.
Ah, okay.
And we probably advise them an inspection that using that on a junction would be grasping if their robot looks like it's designed to do that, but it wouldn't fail them. Just
Awesome.
probably get the penalties when they use it in a match.
Got it. Okay, understood. Thank you.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is one more thing added that the refs will need to keep track of. This is not something that we can banish from the field, but
Right.
I think still trying to handle this to the extent we can at inspection is going to make things go smoother.
Yep. Gotcha. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, I guess it's last chance for questions, everyone. Anybody want to guess what the high score will be at championships?
Being optimistic and saying 250. Let's go.
Sounds good. Love to see it.
Plus penalties.
I'm trying to remember what the high score was in Victoria.
I recall they had the highest ones between both regionals, right?
Yes.
Right.
Still trying to bring up the event results, sorry. I suppose we don't want to actually guess what will be the most likely penalty that will be called.
Based on previous events, I suspect I know the answer, and it's human players reaching into the field when there's a robot in the substation. I would love to be proven wrong on that. Please prove me wrong on that.
I second that.
Please don't do it by getting hundreds of some other penalty, just to be clear.
Okay, I guess that wraps up our meeting. Thank you very much to Kyle and our refs and for the teams who came in with questions. I hope this has helped a little bit. And as Kyle pointed out, good luck to all the teams at the championships this weekend.
Thanks, Justine. Thanks all.